Welcome to part 3 of the abandoned Disney attraction Iceberg. If you found this video before seeing parts 1 and 2, take a look in the description or click on the cards in the top right. Once you finish watching those first 2 parts, I'll see you back here. Before we get into the iceberg, here's a quick word from today's sponsor, Honeygain. Honeygain allows you to make extra cash on the side by simply sharing your internet connection through an Android smartphone or your computer. Now, the money to be made isn't all that much, but like many of you, I have subscriptions to lots and lots of different things, from stuff like Netflix for movies to Spotify for music. These little subscriptions add up over time, and if you use Honeygain, you can earn enough money to cover these monthly subscriptions, and all for basically no work. Just for full transparency, this app doesn't collect any personal data. Your internet connection is used by businesses to retrieve various information from the web, like information about prices. Honeygain is like the Google of web monitoring for big companies. Signing up takes less than 1 minute on their website. Just head over to honeygain.com and use code Theorist for a free $5 to your account. This will help you guys get past the $20 threshold much faster. Once you pass the threshold, you can withdraw money through PayPal and even use Bitcoin. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below for that extra $5 and start making that extra money now. Thank you to Honeygain for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get on to the iceberg. Today we will be going over Layer 4, which has a lot of attractions that cannot be enjoyed at the park, but they do have some remnants or references that can be seen in the park to this day. This layer seems to encapsulate the classic Disneyland, Innoventions. I've mentioned this entry before in parts 1 and 2. This entry on the iceberg is what replaced the America Sings attraction at the rotating theater in Tomorrowland. The Innoventions Center saw its official opening date on November 10th, 1998. So I have a personal beef with Disneyland for getting rid of this attraction. I absolutely adored the Innoventions Center growing up, and ever since I discovered it when I was 5, I'd always beg my family to go inside. Now, there was 2 versions of the Innoventions Center that I can recall from going inside myself. There was one version that started off with an animatronic being voiced by Tom Morrow, where you would enter through a spinning platform. Once aboard, 2 pre-shows would occur, and once they ended, you were brought inside the actual Innoventions Center. I keep calling it the Innoventions Center because that's what it was, a center for so-called innoventions, which is a play on words for innovation inventions. There was another version of the entrance which got rid of the entire pre-show and simply allowed you to walk inside of the building immediately. Once inside though, it was the coolest thing ever. There was dozens of gaming systems, VR style rides, light up carpet style video games, driving games with real feedback, an actual Iron Man suit simulation, and just all kinds of fun gadgets and gizmos for people to enjoy. It really was what I believed a center like this should have been, a center full of the latest and cutting edge technology all in one spot. There was also IKEA style rooms where you could see how houses would look in the future. One of my favorite parts was answering this questionnaire thing where it would tell you what your future would look like. Any Disney fan would have loved going inside the center, and I can't imagine the reasoning behind the closure. There was so much to enjoy once you got inside. The thing that sucked most about the entire attraction was that the outside of the building did not do justice for what was inside the building. There was so much to offer, but sadly, like most things, it came to an end. In 2015, Disney would redesign the entire Innoventions attraction into a basic character meet and greet location, but this also wouldn't last. It was named Superhero HQ, and at the time, it was decent. The scenery was pretty immersive and all, but I can never shake the feeling that I missed the old Innoventions Center. This didn't last too long either, as in 2016, it was changed yet again to a Star Wars theme, this time being named the Star Wars Launch Bay, which did a better job at making the entire experience more enjoyable, but still, I don't understand why Disney didn't just keep the original center the way it was and keep adding more and more technology. I can only imagine how cool it would have been to have HTC Vives and full-size VR attractions in there. I think this building's use peaked in 2010 at the height of the Innoventions Center hype. Comment below if you remember the old Innoventions attraction and your personal experience with it. Moving on. Submarine Voyage. Submarine Voyage was the original ride that was in Tomorrowland. Nowadays, we see the Finding Nemo Submarine Voyage ride, but the original ride was just a general deep-sea diving ride. It came to be on June 14th, 1959 with a vehicle capacity of 39 people, which is a weird number of people to have on a ride, but anyways, the ride vehicles looked like basic nautical transport with no real theming going on. To be quite honest, I've been going to Disneyland since I was 4 years old, and I never once realized that this was a ride until the Finding Nemo version came out. That's just how empty the ride usually was. It looked pretty boring on the outside and wasn't really all too exciting. That's just my personal opinion though from looking on the outside. However, I could not be more wrong as the ride itself was very immersive. The ride began with the ride vehicle being lowered into the depths of the lagoon. Here, guests would see various creatures and life forms which included giant sea bass, sea turtles, lobsters, clams, and all sorts of sea life. The narrator voicing everything would then announce that a storm was coming, so to avoid it, you'd have to go deeper into the ocean. The submarine would then dive very deep into the ocean. What was actually happening in reality was the submarine was entering a show building, which helped add to the illusion, but nonetheless, when you were inside the show building, you could see a giant squid, color-changing fish, and even mermaids. Down here was long lost Atlantis statues, and then you'd see a long cross-eyed sea serpent. After this, the submarine would come back up to land and you'd get off the ride. I personally wish they would have kept this version of the ride because it seemed a lot more realistic and creepy than what we have nowadays. The cool thing about the Submarine Voyage was their use of practical effects to really sell the illusion that you were diving deeper into the ocean. One example was this technique of blowing bubbles at this angle to give the illusion that you were diving deeper, while in tandem with this, you'd enter the showroom building, which made everything naturally darker. This really made people feel like it wasn't a ride, but that you were actually going very deep underwater. Let me know your opinion on the replacement ride for the Submarine Voyage in the comments. Moving on. Starcade. The Starcade was an arcade that could be found in between the line for Space Mountain and Star Tours. It was a small entrance with a sign that read Starcade on the front. The initial opening date for the Starcade was on May 27th, 1977. It premiered alongside with Space Mountain as part of a new section of Tomorrowland opening up. Not much footage remains from the early years of the Starcade besides what I'm showing on screen. The Starcade was nothing more than your average arcade. There was some Star Wars theming initially, with a large X-Wing starfighter being hung from the ceiling and the lights on top resembling stars in the galaxy, but besides that, there wasn't too much connection with Star Wars. The entire arcade was initially 2 levels, but for some unknown reason, the second level was closed off starting in the late 1990s. If you went to Disneyland before the closure of the Starcade, then you know about these infamous escalators. I have been to the Starcade since I was about 4 years old, and I've always noticed the escalators were blocked off. I always thought it was just a big coincidence that every time I came, the top floor was closed off. But apparently, there was more games and space to play up top, but was seemingly closed off without an answer as to why. This blockage would remain in front of the escalators for the remainder of the Starcade's life. Crazy enough, the top level was used for a brief period of time to house the arcade machines from the Flynn's Arcade, which is another entry down further on the iceberg. Now, like the Innoventions Center, I love this arcade and it holds a special place in my heart. I used to love when I'd get off Space Mountain and head to the Starcade to waste some time. The games inside never changed for the most part. It was usually riddled with retro arcade games from the 70s and the 80s. You had your usual Pac-Man, Galaga, and Centipede, but this would change in 2012 when Wreck-It Ralph was released. This was when the Starcade started bringing in new machines and at one point had a playable version of the Wreck-It Ralph game that was free to play. It would have been really freaking cool if they made this section into the arcade from Wreck-It Ralph, which is what I thought they were going to go for, but they never went full force on with it. If you had an annual pass to Disneyland, this attraction was definitely something you could be seen frequently enjoying. After a while, you'd get tired of going on these same rides all the time, and that's where the Starcade came in. Blowing off some steam inside this arcade was a wonderful feat. While at the end of the day it's just an average arcade, I think the fact that it was inside Disneyland just made it so much more enjoyable, because whenever you were finished playing games, you could now go enjoy some more awesome Disney rides. Unfortunately for the Starcade, it would come to a close in 2015 where it ceased its function as an arcade. Following the closure, in the year 2017, the Starcade could be seen being used as a welcome center for annual pass holders. Then, later in 2018, the Starcade was no longer accessible to regular park guests, and the only way for anyone to enjoy this arcade space was to rent the space out, as the Starcade was now used as a private event space for corporate functions, with the upper level being converted into an extension of Space Mountain's queue. Funny enough, the space that housed this arcade is still called the Starcade, and to my knowledge, it still has the same exact sign up and running as if the arcade is running business as usual. Comment down below if you remember killing some time in this awesome attraction. Moving on. Rocket Jets. Rocket Jets premiered along with the new Tomorrowland in 1967. This attraction could be found sitting above the former People Mover station. This big observatory thing with rockets circulating around it was actually a ride that anyone could get on. You might be scratching your head wondering how you would even get in line for this ride, as it was on top of another ride. Now, I don't know if this is the only time Disney has ever done something like this, but you would have to take a regular average elevator to get on this ride. This seems very un-Disney to me, because even when rides require you to get onto an elevator, they try to somehow theme it. Much like in the Haunted Mansion, where they play a little show in the elevator so you guys don't realize that you're inside of an elevator going down to a lower floor. In complete contrast, the Rocket Jets elevator is just a normal open screen elevator. Once you get on the ride, it's just a very simple swing attraction. Now, if you are looking at this ride thinking, hey, that looks like the big observatory thing that sits at the entrance to Tomorrowland, you are exactly right, because what you're looking at is the original Rocket Jets ride reskinned and rebuilt to appear different. In 1997, the new Tomorrowland renovation would move the Rocket Jets attraction and place it down below where guests could actually walk to the line. Renaming the ride to be the Astro Orbiter, this attraction remains in the park to this day as a main attraction that you can see before walking into Tomorrowland. And honestly, I think this was a good move on Disney's part, as it definitely makes Tomorrowland appear a lot more futuristic and iconic. I will say though, part of the thrill of this ride was lost. The slogan for the original Rocket Jets was to be high in the sky, with the ride being quite literally higher in the sky than any of the other attractions. Let me know in the comments if you had a chance to get on the original Rocket Jets ride. Moving on. Classic Fantasyland. Classic Fantasyland refers to the original Fantasyland that premiered at the Disneyland Resort on July 17, 1955. Fantasyland was part of the original concept for Disneyland, as it features the iconic Sleeping Beauty Castle as its front entrance, with a ton of major attractions being taken from the original animated movies. Some of the rides that have been there since the beginning are Peter Pan's Flight, Alice in Wonderland, Dumbo the Flying Elephant, King Arthur's Carousel, the Mad Tea Party, and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Now, initially the land had a more Renaissance look and feel, but eventually the land would receive a major update in 1983, transforming itself into a Bavarian village that took inspiration from Pinocchio and is what we see today in the park. There isn't much difference from the original Fantasyland to the one that we see now. The major differences are more so with the rides in the land and not so much the actual land itself. Not much else needs to be said here. Moving on. Monsanto House of the Future. The Monsanto House of the Future was an attraction that premiered in Tomorrowland on June 12th of 1957. The attraction was sponsored by company Monsanto and was built to resemble a concept for future living in the year 1986. It's famously known as the Plastic House of the Future for the use of plastic that encases the home, and basically everything else in the home being made of plastic. While by today's standards this thing is quite an eyesore, people seeing this for the first time in the 1950s were actually taken back by the futuristic style of the home. The reason the house has this iconic cross sign shape was so the owners of the home would have an easier time expanding the house if they wanted to. Imagine one day you walk inside your home and decide, man, our house is way too small. Wouldn't it just be nice to add another room without damaging the integrity of your other rooms in the home? This concept allowed for this to happen, as the idea was that if you wanted to expand the home, you would simply take the windows out and close off that section of the home. Eventually, you would be able to close off every section of the home until it held enough room for you to live in. Besides the outside of the house, going inside was what really wowed guests. The technologies that it featured were the kind of stuff that would have revolutionized everyday life back then. Cabinets and storage that appeared from nowhere, hidden cold zones for storing food behind the cabinets in place of a refrigerator, the bathroom having an adjustable sink with electric razors and toothbrushes being built right into the home, a built-in dishwasher that cleaned its dishes via ultrasonic waves, and to top it all off, there was even a depiction of video call phones in the walls. This is very similar to the popular Ring doorbells that a good amount of people own today. Obviously, a lot of these technologies were merely conceptual and not actually functional, as the technology wouldn't be seen for quite a few more years. That didn't stop Disney from putting these demonstrations in the guest's eye. All of these features combined with the unique design of the house brought in many people to Disneyland for the first time and became a fan favorite amongst parkgoers. It was so popular that the house began seeing more than 400,000 viewers within its first few months. One of the biggest factors in its popularity was the fact that this was one of the few free-to-ride attractions at the Disneyland resort, as back then, Disney was still on the e-ticket system. Unfortunately, as with many attractions that try to depict the future, the ride would have to get constant cosmetic updates, forming the house to be more reflective of the current future and style. This reason, coupled with the fact that the ride had a decreasing amount of visitors, meant that it was overdue for a closure. In 1967, just 10 years after the initial opening, the House of the Future was finally closed. A fun fact about the home before we move on, when the demolition crew finally got around to destroying the House of the Future, it's said that the house was so sturdy that the crew's wrecking balls, torches, chainsaws, and jackhammers all failed and were unable to make so much as a dent in the house's structure. What happened with the wrecking balls was when they tried using them, they just simply bounced off the house. Eventually, the initially planned one-day demolition took almost a week, with the crew using choker chains to crush the building into smaller parts. On a lighter note, the Monsanto House of the Future's legacy lives on in many of Disneyland's creations, as it gave inspiration for other attractions such as the Carousel of Progress and the Innovention Center. Comment below if you are one of the lucky few that got to see this attraction in person. Moving on. America Sings. With the closure of the Carousel of Progress, the rotating theater in Tomorrowland would see a new attraction, an attraction called America Sings. America Sings was an attraction born out of America's upcoming bicentennial. This attraction was a stage show celebrating the history of American music. Despite not fitting the theme of Tomorrowland, the ride was greenlit because of how well it fit the original design of the theater. America Sings had a cast of animatronic characters singing all of these various songs. The design of these characters was based on the never-created Disney film, The Chanticleer. The film Chanticleer had a ton of concept art that Disney didn't want to go unused, so they used a fair amount of it in America Sings. The show was split into 6 sections, which obviously fit the design of the theater, with a prologue/loading area to start off with, then getting into 5 acts. Act 1 was the early South, Act 2 the Old West, Act 3 the gay 90s, Act 4 the modern times, and the last act being a finale and exiting area. The show was hosted by 2 entities, a patriotic looking eagle named Sam and this owl named Ollie. When the show started, Sam would begin singing Yankee Doodle before introducing the show to the audience. Then as the show would rotate through each act, Sam would end each act performing different renditions of Yankee Doodle. Sam and Ollie appear in each act, wearing different clothes to represent each era that they are in. The attraction featured over 39 songs with tons of lifelike animatronics. It was actually quite impressive that all of this was combined into one long show. Now the show didn't come without its few controversies. There are 2 big controversies that are always talked about. One that covers racism towards people of Mexican heritage, and the last one being a death that happened during one of the showings of the attraction. If you don't feel comfortable hearing about either of these incidents, look below in the comments for timestamps. You can skip to whichever one you'd like, or even skip both. Okay, now that I've warned you, let's get into the first one. Among the list of songs for the show, there was one song titled "Who Shot a Hole in My Sombrero?" This song was originally sang and performed in a Mexican accent. In fact, the show debuted with this original accent in place, but the press thought the accent was so offensive that Disney would be forced to replace the Mexican accent with a Texas accent. Here is a before and after so you guys can compare.
Shot the hole in my sombrero. Who would do a terrible thing like that? Was it Pancho from the rancho? Did he do this because I kissed his wife?
I can't figure who pulled that trigger. You don't reckon my old wife could be back in town?
Now, besides the cultural issue, America Sings is home to one of the most horrific and grotesque accidents that any theme park has ever encountered. Less than 2 weeks after the initial opening of America Sings, 18-year-old cast member Deborah Gale Stone was working a late shift on the ride. Her job was to simply be a hostess that would greet guests as they made their way to their seats. Now, just so you guys understand how severe this incident was, Deborah Stone was an aspiring young adult like you and me. At the time, she had been saving up enough money to attend Iowa State University and even had plans to marry her current boyfriend. Unfortunately for her, on July 8, 1974, she would talk to her parents on the phone for the last time. Just before the last show began for the night, Deborah called her parents, telling them how much she loved her boyfriend, asking for their permission to marry him in the near future. Shortly after this phone call ended, the last show began. During the show, guests became alert after hearing the screams of a young woman. Being that the show was very dark when transitioning between acts, no one knew where the sound came from. Guests reported the scream to cast members, which confused people as majority of the people believed that the scream was a part of the show. The truth eventually came out when people realized that the scream came from Deborah Stone. She had been crushed to death between the stationary wall of the seating area and the rotating wall of the stage. There has been much speculation as to how she ended up between these walls in the first place. Some explain how she must have stepped back too far from the stationary floor just at the wrong time, while others think she fell just before the wall came closing in. Disney learned from their mistake and installed breakaway walls as well as indicator lights. The parents of Deborah sued Disney for a small settlement and the situation quickly died down. Sadly, America Sings is more known for this death and not the joy that it brought many parkgoers. I can't imagine how hard this must have been on the family, and I don't even want to think about that situation happening to anyone that I know. The attraction would close in 1988, but thankfully, the animatronic characters were savored and put to use in what makes up today's Splash Mountain. Not much else needs to be said. Moving on. Videopolis. Back in the 1980s, Disneyland was going through a big rough patch. Park attendance was declining as well as just general interest in going to Disneyland. The main reason for this was the lack of exciting thrill attractions for teenagers. You have to remember, at this time, the only rides that were there were rides that small children would enjoy. Children would beg their parents to bring them, and therefore, Disneyland's main demographic during this time was children and adults. The problem was that the group in the middle, specifically people from ages 12 to 21, had no real reason to go to the park. Disneyland's CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, quickly realized this when he brought his teenage son to the park and saw that there were no real attractions for him to go on. The solution for this came in the form of another attraction. In real 80s fashion, a teenage nightclub for people ages 14 to 21 was made up that went by the name of Videopolis. This nightclub was meant to appeal to those teenage kids that had no real reason to go to Disneyland. Now, if you're sitting there scratching your head going, wait, so there was actually a nightclub inside Disneyland? Does that mean if I wanted to go to it, I'd have to purchase a ticket for the day if I wanted to go into the nightclub? That's exactly what you'd have to do. That might sound like a lot of money, but back then, Disneyland tickets were only $15, and the nightclub allowed entry without anything else besides having just your normal Disneyland ticket. Another question you might have is, who the hell came up with this idea and why? Videopolis was actually stolen from another famous amusement park at the time, Knott's Berry Farm. Knott's seems to have been the first park that introduced a nightclub in the form of Studio K, which was the same thing as Videopolis, but a bit lower budget. The main difference was that Studio K only costed $8 and it was built first. Videopolis actually did wonders for Disneyland, as there was a huge surge in park attendance after it went public. In its heyday, Videopolis had 70 screens with 2 humongous screens front and center. Videos would play on the screens showing popular music videos of the time period while people were out on the dance floor. The building also had a huge seating area with over 1,500 seats. This was so that during the day, the Videopolis building could run stage plays or events, and then at nighttime, the building would transform into the high-tech dance club. Videopolis was built in 1985 in the corner of Fantasyland. It was put in the corner because of how loud the music would get during the nighttime. For nearly a decade, the club would stay as teenagers enjoyed dancing the night away. It was so popular at one point that Disney began selling annual passes for Videopolis. For $90, you could have a season pass that allowed you access into Disneyland just to go to Videopolis. The only catch was that you could only go into the park after 5 p.m. Unfortunately, in 1995, the Videopolis Theater was changed into what we now see today as the Fantasyland Theater. There were many reasons for this change. The first came in the form of lawsuits. There was a lot of hate towards gay people during this time. In fact, if you were seen dancing with a partner of the same sex, the guards at Videopolis were trained to throw you out. One specific event that happened occurred when 2 gay men were thrown out of the club. This resulted in the 2 men winning a court case against Disneyland on the bounds of discrimination, citing that they should be able to dance together without any repercussions. And that's when Disneyland pulled one of the pettiest moves I've ever seen from a company this huge. I just really wanted to mention this because it made me laugh so freaking hard when I found out what Disney did. So, when Disney realized that they were going to lose this case, they found out a loophole out of the entire situation. The way that the case was framed and worded gave Disney a way out. The judge asked for Disney to allow the 2 gay men to dance. So Disney allowed it, but only for those 2 men. Disney outright said, "Yeah, you guys are right. We will allow these 2 specific men to dance, but any other same-sex couple or people will be thrown out if they are seen dancing together." This is the pettiest shit I've ever heard, and honestly made me crack up so hard because I can't even believe Disney was allowed to pull crap like this back in the day. Besides this case though, Disney eventually allowed same-sex dancing, but there was an even bigger issue that came up: gang violence. During the 80s in Los Angeles, it wasn't uncommon to find people from ages 14 to 21 in gangs. There were 2 separate incidents in which gang violence occurred on the park premises, with one event resulting in a kid getting shot to death and another in which 2 people were stabbed. This led to the decline in attendance of Videopolis, and eventually the entire place would close. Leave a comment below on your personal opinion of this attraction and if you'd go there if given the chance today. Moving on. Adventure Through Inner Space. The Adventure Through Inner Space was the attraction that originally occupied where current-day Star Tours is located. This attraction first came to be when Monsanto approached Disneyland with a sponsorship. Monsanto, as you should know from earlier on the Iceberg, was the company that brought the Monsanto House of the Future to Disneyland. The Imagineers wanted to create an experience like no other. They wanted people to feel like they were shrinking down to the size of a molecule, experiencing life on a microscopic level. The main theme of this ride was water, as the entire ride was supposed to be you shrinking down to the size of a small snowflake, getting to see the inner workings and dimensions of such an object. This ride brought a lot of new ideas to the table, with the major one being the ride vehicles that the attraction was set to use. The Imagineers had an idea of what they wanted people to experience when on the ride, but the issue that they were running into was that they wanted to be able to control the guest's perspective when on the attraction. The solution to this was to simply make the ride vehicles concave in so that it blocked off guests' peripheral vision. Then the idea was to simply make the vehicles able to rotate 360 degrees in order to fully control what guests would experience on this ride. If you've ever gone on the Haunted Mansion, the ride vehicles in that ride are the same design as the ones on the Adventure Through Inner Space. Now that Imagineers had come up with the ride idea and how they were going to achieve it, the only thing left to do was to create the ride. Finally, in 1967, the ride was released to the public. The cool thing about this attraction was that it was also a free-to-ride attraction like the Monsanto House of the Future, being exempt from the e-ticket system. The ride itself was revolutionary, as many recall it having one of the first very creative and stunning ride queues, with guests being able to see other parkgoers shrinking down to the size of a snowflake. Apparently, this illusion was done so well that children getting on the ride truly believed that they were shrinking down. All the while, you had narration from Paul Frees telling you of what's going to happen. This was done by having speakers within all of the ride vehicles. Once you got through the microscope, the narrator would tell you of his past journeys, being shrunken down himself, taking you through a labyrinth of snowflakes. Guests would then be treated with a giant snowflake, ensuring them that they had in fact shrank down. You would begin to shrink even further, reaching a room full of molecules. Mirrors were used here in order to make the room appear as if it was packed with more molecules than it actually had. The journey continued further, with guests shrinking down to the mere size of an atom. The narration began again, asking himself if he wanted to go even further. The narrator would then tell himself that he should get back to normal size, at which point guests were met with the end of the ride growing back to normal size. The ride would end with a walkthrough of products from Monsanto. Eventually, this part of the ride would transform into a gift shop, creating one of the first rides that ended with a gift shop for guests to walk into. The ride went through some changes during its run. When the ride opened, teenagers began trying to steal the molecules that were actually just wire balls hanging from the ceiling. This prompted Disney to install cameras in the ride and speed the ride up. However, this ended up screwing over the timing that the audio in the vehicles had, which made the ride seem off. The ride was super unique and had quite a long run, lasting almost 18 years until it was eventually replaced by Star Tours. Leave a comment below if you were lucky enough to get on the Adventure Through Inner Space. Moving on. Rocket to the Moon. Rocket to the Moon opened in 1955 along with the opening of Disneyland. There's not much history to this ride. Walt Disney simply wanted to create a ride that made guests feel as though they were being shot to the moon and back. This was the first attraction to ever take normal, everyday people through such a simulation, as real space travel wouldn't be achieved until 1961 when Yuri Gagarin was successfully launched into space. By the way, I have another Iceberg series that goes over some interesting theories on that space endeavor. Anyways, Rocket to the Moon was a simple ride. It was located near the back of Tomorrowland and took place inside the building that we know today as the Alien Pizza Planet, or you guys might know it as the Red Pizza Port. The ride featured round theater seating with all of the guests sitting around a circular screen on the floor and a circular screen on the ceiling. A film would begin playing as the ground shook. Guests would then shoot up into the sky, with the floor screen showing guests leaving the Disney theme park and the top screen showing their destination, the moon. Guests would simply make a journey around the moon once and then safely land back down to Earth. During the flight, a narrator would begin talking, teaching guests facts about the moon. The ride would go through two major changes during its lifetime, with it being renamed as Flight to the Moon when New Tomorrowland opened in 1967 under the McDonnell Douglas sponsorship. Then it was changed yet again in 1975 to Mission to Mars. The main difference between these two rides was now you would be taking a journey to Mars instead of the moon, but the entire process was basically the same. Unfortunately, due to declining interest in space travel, the ride closed on November 2nd, 1992, and wouldn't see the light of day until nearly 6 years later as Red Rocket's Pizza Port. A scaled down replica of the original rocket used on display for Rocket to the Moon was put in front of the restaurant and can be seen to this day. Leave a comment below sharing your own personal anecdote with this ride. Moving on. Mike Fink's Keelboats. Mike Fink's Keelboats is an attraction based on Disney's version of Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett is a character from Walt Disney's Disneyland series, which was a series that debuted on TV, showcasing stories relating to various lands around Disneyland. Frontierland's rendition utilized Davy Crockett to tell its story. In one episode, there was a keelboat race against Mike Fink, King of the River. During the production of this episode, Walt Disney thought it would be an awesome idea to utilize the real boats used for the episode as a ride to be featured in Frontierland. And so, the ride known as Mike Fink's Keelboats was born. The original boats from the TV show were used, but were remodeled in order to put windows so that people could fit inside the boats. Guests were given a choice between riding Davy Crockett's Bertha May or Mike Fink's Gollywhumper. The ride simply took you around the rivers of America with some narration playing in the background. This one did close one time during 1995 but reopened later in 1996. However, when it returned, a major accident occurred, which, unlike a lot of the other entries on this list, actually got the ride closed. During one ride of the Keelboats, the Gollywhumper boat is said to have been overloaded with guests on the top level, and due to being overloaded, the boat began rocking from side to side until eventually it capsized, dumping a full boat of guests into the rivers of America. The boat, along with the Bertha May, were removed from the river for inspections. The people that rode the boats that day would be the last people to ever ride Mike Fink's Keelboats. The Bertha May was put up for auction on eBay and sold for over $15,000. As for the Gollywhumper, well, they returned to the rivers of America as a prop. After sitting there for some years, accruing nasty algae and dust, the boat was restored to its original 1955 appearance and placed back in the river. This was all done when in 2010, Disneyland drained the rivers of America for a park revamp. Even after the 2017 rerouting of the rivers of America to make way for Star Wars Land, the Gollywhumper still remains in the rivers to this day. Leave a comment below if you or anyone you know was able to get on the original Mike Fink's Keelboats. Moving on. Original Pirates of the Caribbean. So a lot of people might be shocked to learn that the Pirates of the Caribbean ride wasn't based on the movie. The movie was actually based on the ride. This becomes more apparent when you realize that the ride came out in 1967 and the movie was released nearly 26 years later in 2003. The original idea for Pirates of the Caribbean was created sometime after the New York World's Fair. Because of the World's Fair, Walt Disney and the Imagineers decided that they wanted to utilize audio animatronics on a pirate-themed ride. The attraction had to be built underneath New Orleans Square in order for there to be enough room for the entire attraction. The original ride featured lots of crude and shocking elements by today's standards. And of course, because the ride came out first, Jack Sparrow and all the other movie references were not on the original ride, so it was a totally different experience than what you might see today. The ride that we know today tells the story of Captain Barbossa and his gang of pirates that ravaged a town looking for Jack Sparrow. But the original version told a much simpler story. The original attraction showed a gang of pirates that ransacked a town and had their way with pretty much everyone there. This version included animatronics that implied very crude acts, such as this part right here, where a pirate can be seen holding a shoe and an undergarment belonging to presumably the lady in the barrel next to him, implying that he forced himself onto this poor woman. Also, the woman animatronics that run in circles chasing the men was originally the other way around, with dirty men chasing the women, with the only overweight woman being the one that is chasing the man. While at first people thought that these scenes were comical, people eventually began ridiculing and criticizing the ride for its depiction of women and the crude acts. The ride went through some changes until eventually the movie came out and the ride was changed into what we see today. Funny enough, one of these scenes that remains is the Wench Bride auction scene. Disney says that they believe some stuff should be kept in for historical accuracy, and as such, we are left with this scene in the ride to this day. The only Pirates of the Caribbean version that remains untouched from the original design is the one in Disneyland Paris. That Pirates of the Caribbean still has all of the offensive events within the attraction. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the original version of Pirates of the Caribbean. Moving on. Flying Saucers. The Flying Saucers was the original Luigi's Flying Tires. This ride was conceived out of the 1961 Tomorrowland obsession with space travel. The poster itself tells you enough. I like this version of the ride much better than Luigi's Flying Tires, so it's basically the same idea as before. You ride on a hockey puck and the floor is the hockey table. The difference here is that each ride vehicle only sat one person, which is how it should have been done with Luigi's Flying Tires. Just like Luigi's Flying Tires, this ride was prone to one big problem: steering the freaking saucers. It was a bit better with this incarnation. As you can see from the videos, you actually bump people in this ride instead of just slowly making your way towards them and giving them a little love tap. However, the problem you can see almost immediately is that if you didn't weigh enough or were unable to control your weight, you'd flop around like a fucking idiot like this. This ride even did a better job managing the queue times, as there were 64 flying saucers in total, with 32 flying saucers being in use at any given time. The ride, as stated before, sat in Tomorrowland, and it was actually smack dab in the middle. If you've ever eaten at that burger place in Tomorrowland that holds those Star Wars shows occasionally, that stage that the shows are held on is where the Flying Saucers ride used to be. The Flying Saucers would be short-lived, as the remodel for New Tomorrowland came in 1967, which cut the ride in favor of the Tomorrowland stage. I honestly would have loved to go on this ride instead of what we got nearly a few decades later. Leave a comment below on which ride you'd rather go on: Luigi's Flying Tires or the Flying Saucers. Moving on. Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland. Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland first debuted as a different name in 1956. In 1956, the ride premiered in Frontierland as Rainbow Caverns Mine Train. The original ride took guests on a tour through the fictional Rainbow Caverns. Honestly, this ride was beautiful, especially once you entered inside the caverns. The problem that this ride suffered is that it wasn't originally captivating enough for guests. Walt Disney himself even admitted this and said that he wanted more from the attraction. And in Walt Disney fashion, he spent almost $2 million renovating the ride, and 4 years later in 1960, the ride debuted as the Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland. The $2 million went towards creating a fictional wonderland. The difference between the original ride and this new one was the introduction of 200 plus animal animatronics and more beautifully done set pieces. The ride began in the mining town of Rainbow Ridge, taking you through a train tunnel into what they called Beaver Valley. All the while a narrator would talk of the sights. Fun fact, the narrator for this ride is the same narrator for Big Thunder Mountain. Anyways, after Beaver Valley, you'd make your way under the waterfalls of Cascade Peak, passing into Bear Country, then the Living Desert, and then ending with the colorful depths of the Rainbow Caverns. As you can see from the footage, Walt Disney went all out, putting in as many lifelike animatronics as he could in the ride to give it that extra oomph that it needed to captivate guests into going on it again and again. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, as the ride would close in 1977 in favor of a more iconic and thrilling attraction, Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, which opened in 1979. Now, the original Nature's Wonderland ride still lives on in Big Thunder Mountain. For example, the town of Rainbow Ridge can be seen at the end of Big Thunder Mountain. It's also a part of this attraction's loading area. Some of the skeletons, such as the dinosaur skeleton, are used in Big Thunder Mountain as well. The caverns at the beginning of Big Thunder Mountain are a nod to the old Rainbow Caverns, although they are not quite as colorful. If you got to experience this ride for yourself when it originally came out, leave a comment below detailing your experience. Moving on. Triton's Garden. Triton's Garden refers to the old meet and greet area in Fantasyland that premiered in 1996. If you remember the Monsanto House of the Future, that attraction was replaced by another attraction simply called the Alpine Gardens, which was then turned into King Triton's Garden from the Little Mermaid series. The cool thing about the change from the Monsanto House to Triton's Garden is that Triton's Garden officially marked this plot of land to belong to Fantasyland instead of the original Tomorrowland. Even though the garden is based on the Tomorrowland side of the Matterhorn, it still counts as being part of Fantasyland. Walking up to the garden, you could see King Triton in the lake with water coming out of his trident. Streams of water would shoot out of the ground, and you could even see Ariel resting on a waterfall fountain. Walking further into the garden revealed Ariel's grotto, which was the official meet and greet spot for that character. When it was time for Ariel to meet the guests, her shell would turn around, revealing her waiting for people to take pictures. This spot lasted nearly 12 years as it came to an end in August of 2008. This part of the area was transformed into what we now know today as Pixie Hollow. Most of you may remember another place by the name of Ariel's Grotto in California Adventure. That's because there was a restaurant that used to be named Ariel's Grotto, and funny enough, Disney didn't want to waste their statue of King Triton, so they removed it from the water and just sat it on top of the restaurant. Unfortunately, you can't view it today anymore, as even the restaurant has been changed into another by the name of Lamplight Lounge. I believe when I was younger, I went to Ariel's Grotto once, but I remember it very vividly. I did, however, get a chance to eat at the restaurant Ariel's Grotto in California Adventure before it closed. Leave a comment below detailing your own experience with either of these attractions. This actually brings us to the end of today's video. I wanted to say thanks to everyone that's been joining us on the journey to 100,000 subscribers. We are already almost at 25k. In the last 2 days, we've gained nearly 1,000 subscribers, which is honestly mind-boggling. I remember 4 months ago, I was happy to gain 1,000 subscribers for just 1 month. So the fact that we're doing that in nearly 2 days is freaking crazy. I love you guys all so much. Don't forget to join the Discord. There's a link in the description as well. Also, make sure to check out the sponsor of today's video, Honeygain, if you guys want to support me. Be sure to keep on the lookout to part 3 of the disturbing internet content Iceberg. If you guys enjoyed today's video, be sure to subscribe and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss another upload. With all of that said, I will see you all in the next video. Thanks for watching.